Okay, the mini lesson on the romantic literary elements, and the purpose of this is to discover some of the stylistic techniques and poetic elements of the romantic poets, and you should know that this is of the utmost importance. So let's take a look. Here are some things that I think you should already know. At some point, your seniors, you should have discussed all of these, but in case you don't, or you could have forgotten, then we're going to do a little review. So first, dialect, and this is the way a person speaks. It tells you where he or she is from. Speaker, which is the imaginary voice or persona assumed by the author of the poem. For example, we're going to be reading a poem that's actually written from a child's perspective. So even though the poet himself is an adult, the author is an adult, the speaker in the poem is a child. So we have to distinguish that the speaker is not always the poet. Okay, we have tone, which is the attitude the writer takes toward a subject or a character, and you know that you very might often say the tone is maybe sarcastic, the tone is sympathetic or kind. Symbol, a person, thing, or event that stands both for itself and for something beyond itself. So when we read, and last year many of you probably read F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, and it's full of symbols. There's the East End or East Egg and West Egg, which are places, and they're actually real places, but they also symbolize, new money and old money. And so they have sort of, there's two meanings behind them. And of course, theme, and we've been talking about this since the beginning, and this is the central idea or insight of a work of literature. And blank verse, which is unrhymed iambic pentameter. And I think that, the iambic pentameter gets a little complicated, or can be, certainly to mimic and write on your own, but you should just know they're not rhyming necessarily anymore, and in the Romantics they get a little bit, they start to experiment with some of the forms and the classic forms. So the new literary terms that we're going to look over are moral lesson, epigraph, paradox, romantic lyrics, apostrophe, meditative poem, and ode. So let's take a little look here. All right, first, a moral lesson. The definition of this is the particular value or lesson the author is trying to get across to the reader. So I always say the classic moral lesson is the boy who cried wolf. And we all know the story. He cries wolf, and people come, and there's no wolf, and he thinks it's a funny joke. And then when there is an actual wolf, no one believes the boy, and the wolves eat him. Sort of a little bit of a harsh story to tell children, actually, when you think about it. However, I guess it teaches the moral lesson, not to lie. So the epigraph, it's very simple, just an opening quotation, and sometimes we'll see an epigraph before a poem. And some of the books, modern books, they have epigraphs. I know in the Mortal Instruments series of books, they use epigraphs, and also in even the Twilight series, there's sometimes a quote. I've seen some Shakespeare quotes and some quotes from some other poets just before the chapters. So, paradox, an apparent contradiction that's actually true. Here's Dickens' paradox. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Well, how can it be both the best of times and the worst of times? And yet, we've experienced this, and this could be true. So it's something that's considered a paradox. Okay, so the romantic lyric. Most of the poetry, or a lot of it that's written the Romantic period, falls under sort of these categories, and includes the sonnet, the ode, the meditative poem. At least that's the things that we're going to sort of be looking at. And the sonnet is a 14-line poem, and the Romantics, you should know that they experimented with this form specifically. We will be reading an ode to the west wind, and it's a complex, it's a generally long lyric, and it's on a serious subject. And an ode to the west wind is definitely a serious subject about, re-engaging back in life after some hardships. And we'll learn more about that. The meditative poem, this is a poem in which we are to imagine a person speaking. So stanzas start and end where it makes sense, as opposed to following a strict format where in the sonnet, the first, there's the octave and the sestet, so it's broken up from 8 lines, and then 6 lines for a second stanza. That's how it is. That is the sonnet. And the sonnet, has a turn. It's going to typically have a conceit in there. And so it's very specific about what a sonnet requires. And I think it's, nothing wrong with it at all. I sort of like it. I think the limitations promote creativity. However, they start to break away from those limitations and just sort of take off. Because they're all about, questioning the status quo during the Romantic era. An apostrophe, we're going to see a lot of this. And this is basically, it's a figure of speech, right, in which a speaker directly addresses an absent or dead person, an abstract quality, or something non-human, as if it were present and capable of responding. So if Robert Burns' poem, you could consider it an apostrophe. He's talking to a mouse. He's addressing a mouse as if the mouse could respond, which is obviously silly, but it's to create a specific effect. Parallelism. The repetition of words, phrases, or sentences that have the same grammatical structure or that restate a similar idea. And we will see some of these as well. An example here is cruelty has a human heart, and jealousy a human face, terror the human form divine, and secrecy the human dress. And so you can see it's the parallel structure. First of all, the fact that human gets repeated all 4 times, and it's trying to take things such as cruelty, jealousy, and terror, and in some ways give them a human quality to it. And then finally, the Byronic hero. Not to be confused with an ironic hero. Okay, that's a hero who saves the day unexpectedly. Like Inspector Clouseau might be considered an ironic hero. The Byronic hero, on the other hand, is mad, bad, and dangerous to know. That's, I think, the simplest definition for it. And some examples of the Byronic hero. I think one of the earlier ones would be with Marlon Brando. Often played the Byronic hero in his earlier movies, and I think of like a Streetcar Named Desire. And the other sort of classic example that's always brought up is James Dean, a rebel without a cause. And he could be considered a Byronic hero. There is one other definition of the Byronic hero, though, that I'd like to give you, and it is, I guess, here's how it's described by Thomas Babington Macaulay. A man proud, moody, cynical, with defiance on his brow and misery in his heart, a scorner of his kind, implacable in revenge, yet capable of deep and strong affection. And so I thought that was a pretty neat description, but it's going to be someone moody, intellectually searching, incapable of compromise, and forever brooding over some mysterious past. So there's a bit of that mystery, and painfully yet defiantly alone. These are all things that could be used to describe the Byronic hero. And those are some of the Romantic period literary elements. And of course, the Byronic hero is named after Lord Byron, whose real name is George Gordon. And that's it. So now it's time to see how these all play in to the poetry.